Okay, welcome back, folks. Hope everyone's doing well. Today we've got a bunch of things to do. We have to first talk about your first assignment in the course, which I've now posted to eClass, at least in part. I'll explain that in a moment. Um, so we'll first talk about our first assignment in the class. I should also just mention before I started recording there was a question from someone in the class asking about the mid-course exam, which is again scheduled for June 23rd. And that exam, I'll say more about that in the coming weeks. But that exam will, of course, is in person, as I've already said many times. I'll let you know the location of that. But it is also good, it will cover everything up to that point in the course. So it'll cover the first two dialogues, the Apology and Credo. It'll cover Plato's Republic. It'll cover Aristotle's Politics. It'll cover Machiavelli's The Prince, which we will do next week. And it'll cover Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which we do the following week. Just looking at the chat. If we use the online textbook, how should we cite? Or should we go based on the PDF and email you for, yes, for the assignment? Yes, there is, you should be using the page numbers from the actual textbook and which is accurate in the PDF version. But I believe in the online textbook, I believe, Anna, you're asking about the ebook version that you can access through the library. I believe on that version, I'll double check this over the weekend. I believe it indicates the proper page numbers within it. Like you can see within it the actual page numbers from the textbook within the text. I'll have to look again, but rather than the ebook page, I believe it has a kind of indication of when the hard copy page changes. So I'll have to look at that again and I will get back to you on that. But you should be using the hard copy page numbers, which are accurate on the PDF. And I believe there's a way you can find them on the ebook version as well.
I
Okay.
have the hard copy version, so thankfully that won't be a problem for me.
Okay. Yes, Anna, that sounds good. And for anyone else who hasn't reached out for the PDF to make that all easier, that would be the easiest way of doing that. And and so please do reach out for the PDF if you have not yet. Okay, so we've got to talk about the assignment for today. We have to talk about the kind of wrap up our discussion of Plato's Republic. Just kind of, again, take a few minutes to think about the conclusion of the argument, at least the arguments that we're looking at, and the thread of the text that we're focused on. We're gonna just take stock of that for a few moments again, and then we have to turn our attention briefly to a few sections from Aristotle's Politics to that I think help us to kind of bring some further context and fill in a bit more of the worldview of the ancient Greeks or the especially the Athenians that we're looking at, and also to get to know Aristotle a little bit, who is a student of Plato's and to think about a couple of contrasts between their views, although there are a lot more contrasts between their views that we will not have time to get to. But Aristotle helps us complement, I think, our discussion of Plato in a number of ways. So we'll have a brief discussion before next week, moving on to Machiavelli's The Prince. Okay, so let me first pull up the assignment that I have posted now to eClass. I said a few moments ago that I haven't posted it in its entirety. What I found when I went to post it is that in the new and improved eClass, apparently it is not so new and improved in at least one aspect in the big kind of reboot they gave it of a few months of some time ago, maybe a month ago. I can no longer post more than a couple of paragraphs to explain the assignment, which is unfortunate. So I will either have to problem solve that, or I will just post a separate file with the full guidelines for the assignment because I can't include all of them for some reason in the e-class assignment. Let me just pull up those full guidelines and go over them with you. And then you'll also have next week and the week after in tutorials and in lectures to ask any questions that you have and to clarify anything about the assignment that you're not clear on. Okay. Let's see here. How do I pull up? Sorry, folks, just having an issue finding the document that I want to pull up. All right, just give me a moment. Thanks for your patience. Okay. Sorry about that. Some technical difficulties. All right. So your first assignment in the class looks as follows. It is due, as I mentioned last class, Friday, June 12th. So you have just over 2 weeks to complete this assignment. Friday, June 12th at midnight, essentially. Um, that is, of course, right before our kind of break for a week in the course. So you get this done before the reading break. And then, of course, you're preparing for the exam that we have when we return. So the submission of the document, please submit it in a Word document or word processing document, not as a PDF file, please, via eClass. The length of the assignment is 1,500 to 1,900 words. Please stay within that range. And then I've offered you 2 questions to choose from for this assignment. Okay, the first question is as follows. In the Republic, Plato offers scathing critiques of both the democratic city and the democratic soul. Explain Plato's arguments on democracy and contrast them with Plato's ideal for both the city and the soul while providing lots of textual support and evidence. Then offer your own critical analysis and evaluation of Plato's arguments. Then question 2. In the Republic, Plato is deeply concerned with the causes of both police violence. I put police in quotations because we're not exactly talking about police, but essentially the auxiliary class is a kind of military slash police force. Um, is deeply concerned with the causes of both police violence and political corruption, as well as how to prevent these from happening. Explain Plato's arguments on these themes while providing lots of textual support and evidence. Then offer your own critical analysis and evaluation of Plato's arguments. Okay, so one of these two questions is what you are going to choose for your assignment. You can choose either. And then the guidelines. So the guidelines state the following. Again, this does not appear in the actual submission part of the assignment yet on eClass, but I will post this document alongside it so that you have access to these full guidelines. The main task of this assignment is to demonstrate that you have read the text carefully, engaged with the ideas and arguments in it, and substantiated your interpretation and analysis of it using lots of textual support. Your paper should exhibit an ability to explain and analyze the arguments from the Republic in your own words, as well as to provide regular evidence from the text in the form of direct quotations and paraphrases, both with specific page citations. So you're trying to show and offer an interpretation and critical analysis of the relevant arguments in this text, and you are showing and documenting that you have read this text by providing regular support from the text to document your reading of it and to show how you derive your interpretation of it, pointing directly to things that Plato says in our textbook, in order to do so, and then substantiating your analysis, critical analysis and evaluation of Plato's arguments by referring to and pointing to specific parts of his argument in the text. So for this assignment, you should not use any sources other than the Republic. Your quotations and page references must refer to the Morgan textbook that is assigned for our course and must be accurate to both its specific translation of the text and its page numbers. If your paper does not contain textual evidence, and if you do not provide accurate citations and quotations from our textbook, you will receive a 0 on this assignment. When citing the text, simply provide a parenthetical citation that includes both the textbook page number and the paragraph line number that can be found in the margins. Okay, so for example, a citation should appear as follows: page 133 of the textbook, and paragraph line number 424B. So you should be providing both of these, page number and paragraph number, in your citations. All of your citations should point to a specific paragraph or a limited range of paragraphs in the text, never to the text as a whole. So you should never, a proper citation does not just include, the Republic. or the Republic Book One. That's way too general. You have to provide a reference to a specific part of the text, a specific set of a specific line, specific paragraph, or a specific set of range of paragraphs, a very limited range of paragraphs. Um, okay, just looking at the chat. Yeah, there's a would a Google document be okay? Yes. Well, if I'd prefer if you download your Google document as a Word document, as Aaron suggests, and upload it that way, that's great. And Jade is asking, can we also use lecture notes? Ideally, actually, a lecture notes is like it's ideally you would be going to the text and providing evidence that you get from the text, because even the lecture is not, it's not really easy to cite the lecture. It's also not really, the point is to show a reading of the text. And so even the things we talk about in the lecture, including my own um, interpretations of the text, go back at some point to the text itself. So you should be able, ideally, a stronger form of citation is to go to the text and to be able to locate in the text a certain kind of interpretation. Now, so I wouldn't suggest citing the lecture. Um, at least not much, maybe in very isolated, very kind of limited ways. You could cite the lecture, and if you do so, it should be specific. So you should provide, say, the timestamp of the lecture from the lecture recording rather than just May 21st lecture. That's too general. You should go to provide the timestamp from the video recording of the lecture. But even then, I would suggest to do that in a very, very limited way, not to do that very much, because that's not really a very substantial form of citation. Um, okay, so back to the assignment here. Uh, so this is how the citation should be. A parenthetical citation with both the textbook page number and the paragraph line number from the margins of the Republic. Late essays will be assessed a penalty of 5% per day, including weekends, as it says in the syllabus. And then, of course, please note that plagiarism and academic dishonesty are very serious academic offenses. Please be sure that your essay is produced entirely by you and for this assignment and course. You are not permitted to use ChatGPT or other generative AI to produce any part of your essay. In fact, you should actively treat it as part of your task to show us that you are reading and engaging with the text directly and not using AI. There are, of course, very clear indications, there's very clear signs of how AI uses a text that is quite apparent and not what we're looking for in this assignment. You should be showing us by using very specific citations, by using your own voice, which is distinctive from an AI bot. You should be uh, using these things to show us that you are engaging directly with the text and analyzing it in your own voice. If we detect the use of generative AI, we may request an oral examination to test your comprehension of the material in your essay, or your assignment will simply be given no credit in very obvious cases. Please consult with your TAs in case you have any questions or require clarification. Please submit your paper on eClass as a Word document only, not as a PDF, and follow all instructions in the syllabus for essay assignments. Please stay within the required word range in order to receive full credit and to avoid penalties. So, the word range is given for a reason. In any kind of writing assignment or job or what have you, there are always word limits and word ranges, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a academic, what have you, deciding, working within a certain range and having to exercise the judgment to decide what is most relevant, what is most important to include given the space that you have. That is a skill in itself, and it's one skill we're asking you to exercise in this assignment. So please stay within the assigned word range. Okay, so that is the assignment. You have a little bit over 2 weeks to complete it. Of course, things are a bit compressed, and so in this kind of very compressed summer course, so you've got to be working on this assignment. You've also got to be keeping up with your readings and making sure that you are on top of that because, of course, um, the first half exam is very shortly after your first paper is due. So you've got to be juggling lots of things here in this compressed and intensive summer course. So please make sure that you are doing so. John, you have a question?
Yes. So there is no use of any other sources whatsoever, even if they're supplementary.
No, I would like you to just work with our text. This is not a research essay beyond that. I want you to work closely with the text that we are reading. So,
So you can't include anything to contextualize Athenian democracy or political corruption or police brutality.
no, perhaps maybe I should say, perhaps if you as you are offering your own critical analysis and evaluation of the text, then perhaps there's some sources that you may have read that you might want to cite at some point when you're offering your own kind of reflections. That may be allowable, but really for the bulk of this assignment, what we're asking you to do is to work with this text. We want to clear out all the weeds, simplify things, and just ask you to focus on this text and to work with it, think with it, read it, engage with it. And so that's the main task of this assignment. So, not asking you to read secondary sources on Plato, not asking you to, um, uh, uh, just asking you to read this text and work with it. Gurnur?
Professor, I was wondering if there's a specific citation style that you prefer.
I've just outlined that in the
You said
guidelines
parentheses,
here.
right?
Sorry?
You prefer brackets or parentheses?
Yeah, it's this parenthetical citation from the
Right.
text that indicates both the page number of the textbook and the line number of the marginal line numbering system within the text.
Right. So would that be AP or MLA? Because then we also have to do like, the word side word the works cited. So would that
Mhm.
be MLA format or APA?
I'm not that concerned about that part because we're just asking
Okay.
you to just use the textbook. So, we what format citation you use to cite the one book that we're asking you to use is not that important to me. It's just more a matter of the clarity of citing both the page number of our textbook and the line number of the text. So the style of citation of the textbook itself, I would say, I mean, you can clarify this with your TAs if they have a preference, but I certainly don't have a preference, and I don't think it matters too much since we're just asking you to read this one text.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll leave it there with the assignment. Of course, we've got many more classes for you to ask questions. You've got a couple of tutorials next week and the week after. Some of you have tutorials today, but I wouldn't go in there necessarily ready to discuss a bunch of questions about this assignment, mainly because I didn't provide the assignment to the TAs in advance of giving it to you, and so they will still have to look at it and consider it and talk about it next week and the week after. So work with the assignment, read it over. Next week, you can ask questions in tutorials and discuss it. I'm sure your TAs will be discussing it in the next couple of weeks in tutorials, and then you'll have chance to ask me questions in lecture over the coming weeks as well. And I will find a way to post these full guidelines rather than just the basic essay questions that the Turnitin assignment allowed me to um, post on eClass. Okay, so we'll leave that there, and I will go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So where we left off last class was with the final image of the three-part soul that they come back to at the end of book 9 to address at least the big challenge of the text that we have highlighted. And of course, that challenge came early on from Thrasymachus, who told us that actually it is more profitable to be unjust than to be just. And that when you are when you are just, when you act morally with virtue, that in fact you are serving the good of somebody else, namely the more powerful actor, the person or people who have had the power to set the rules. So it's a kind of it was an argument that can be captured by that phrase, might makes right. That if you are the strong and the mighty and the powerful, then you get to set the terms of what's right and wrong. And so it's not actually in your interest to do what's considered right, other than, of course, that the powerful force you to do so, and they will under threat of punishment. And so for Thrasymachus, it's not actually good to be just. And that's the kind of gauntlet that he threw down. And then Glaucon and Adeimantus picked up the argument, and they kind of asked Socrates to prove that justice is the highest type of good. It is something that's good in itself and for its consequences. But of course, they said people usually defend justice when they do by extolling its good consequences. They rarely talk about the intrinsic value of being just. And that's largely what Thrasymachus was kind of getting at, that justice doesn't have intrinsic value. And so they want Socrates in the text in that book 1 and 2. They ask him to defend justice as good in itself. That's really what they're wanting him to do. And so that's the big challenge of the text. And so they pose that challenge. They kind of set out to define justice, and they do so by the end of book 4. And then at the end of book 4, they kind of set the question aside before coming back to it at the end of book 9. So I just wanted to go back to that end of book 4 and to notice how they set aside the argument before coming back to it at the end of book 9. And so they've laid out what justice is, and they've laid out the three-part soul, and they've talked about justice as kind of like this proper every part of the soul doing what it is supposed to do, rather than meddling in the work that the other parts of the soul are properly supposed to do. That's a properly ordered soul. That's a just soul. And so then at the end of book 4, this is 445a, Socrates says, so it now remains, it seems, for us to consider whether it is more profitable to do just actions, engage in fine practices, and be just, whether one is known to be so or not, or to do injustice and be unjust, provided that one does not have to pay the penalty and become a better person as a result of being punished. So this is asking, is it better to be just intrinsically, or is it better to be unjust intrinsically? Which is better for the soul, or which is better for us? And Glaucon says, but Socrates, that question seems to me at least to have become ridiculous, now that the two have been shown to be as we've described. Life does not seem worth living when the body's natural constitution is ruined, not even if one has food and drink of every sort, all the money in the world, and every political office imaginable. So how, even if one could do whatever one wished, except what would liberate one from vice and injustice and make one acquire justice and virtue, how could it be worth living when the natural constitution of the very thing by which we live is ruined and in turmoil? And Socrates says, yes, it's ridiculous, but here, we must proceed. And then they kind of say, well, hold on, Socrates, let's talk about some of these other things you mentioned first. And so they take some detours, and they don't actually address this question that Socrates says, okay, they have to address. And they don't actually come back to it until the end of book 9. And what do they say here at the end of book 9? After they talk about this, he says, let's now fashion this final image of the soul. And they talk about this three-part soul with a human part, a lion part, and a many-headed beast that make up the soul and that represent the three parts of the soul that we have, that they have already discussed in book 4. The human part is that it's human because it is our distinctive faculty as human beings, the reasoning part of us, the lion part of us that is our spirit, the courageous element, the discipline, kind of the part of us that has a conscience that is able to be disciplined and hold ourselves to what we know to be good for us, and then the appetites, both necessary and unnecessary appetites that are in our soul that make up the multi-headed beast that um, uh, doesn't work. It works on kind of impulse rather than through reason, but it has to be controlled by our reason with the help of the lion. So Socrates comes back to the argument here in this last part of book 9 that I've assigned to you, and he starts the argument with the following. I won't, you've got to look over these pages and see how the argument unfolds, but he starts the argument as follows here. And this is 480 489a, kind of the paragraph where he's starting this. And he says, when someone claims then that it profits this human being to do injustice, but that doing what is just brings no advantage, let's tell him that he is saying nothing other than that it profits him to feed well and strengthen the multifarious beast, as well as the lion and everything that pertains to the lion, to starve and weaken the human being, the human part, so that he is dragged along wherever either of the other two leads, and not to accustom the other two to one another or make them friends, but to leave them to bite and fight and devour one another. And he goes on to say in the next paragraph, on the other hand, wouldn't someone who claims that what is just is profitable be saying, we should do and say what will give the inner human being the greatest mastery over the human being? So the inner human being, the reason, has to have mastery over the whole self, to get him to take care of the many-headed beast like a farmer, feeding and domesticating the gentle heads and preventing the savage ones from growing, to make the lion's nature his ally, and to care for all in common. So like a farmer, to make to kind of feed and domesticate the beast in us and to make the lion his friend, and to care for all in common, bringing them up in such a way that they will be friends with each other and with himself. So he's saying here, this is the proper image of justice, that the soul that is properly ordered, when you do injustice, especially when you do injustice with total impunity, which again is what the Ring of Gyges allows you to do. So again, that big question was, why should someone that we talked about in book 4 or book 2, why should someone with a Ring of Gyges not use it to do injustice with impunity? Why is justice good in itself? And Plato is saying here, if you do injustice and you never get caught, you never get any punishment, you do it with complete impunity, what you're doing is you are feeding the beasts inside of you and weakening the human being that needs to rule your soul. So the basic kind of claim here about the intrinsic worth of justice is that the health of the soul, the health of our soul, is kind of the most important thing to our happiness. And we've got all these parts of our souls that potentially can be in a civil war with one another, and often are in most real life cases. The different parts of ourselves are not in harmony with one another, but they're in a civil war with one another. And so, we've got all these different parts. We have our reason, and it has the proper role of guiding us towards what is good for us. It has the proper role of being able to calculate and foresee what is good for us. And then we have these other parts of us. They all serve important roles. The disciplined, conscientious part of us has an important role. The appetites within us, both necessary and unnecessary appetites, play an important role. Plato was not some kind of believer in renunciation of all the luxuries of this world, or all the delicacies of this world. That wasn't Plato. He thought all of these appetites have a role, but they are dangerous. They can get out of control very easily. The appetites within us aren't necessarily self-limiting. They are often impulsive, and they are insatiable in many cases. And so they have to be brought to heel by our reason, with the help of our conscientious, disciplined part of ourselves, our spirit. And our appetites, they have a singular focus. They have the focus entirely towards the quenching of the object of their desire. They don't look out for the good, they look out for whatever the object of their desire is. And so they are singularly focused. Only the reason can examine what is good for us as a whole. The appetites can't guide us that way. Only the reason can. And so the reason has to order and limit and balance and channel and guide our appetites and our discipline, our conscience, our kind of these various parts of us that our reason has to guide these more beastly parts of us. And without our reason guiding us towards the good, we are left at the mercy of these beasts within us, and we will not be able to live a good and contented life. We will always be using the metaphor Plato himself uses, we will always be in a kind of civil war against ourselves. Our desires will never be brought into harmony and guided towards a singular purpose and goal for us. And so we will not be able to achieve good things in our lives. We won't be able to maintain good relationships in our lives. We will not live a life of contentment because our soul will be overturned and corrupted. So that is Plato's response, essentially, to why we need to intrinsically be good, and why it harms us to do injustice, even if we can get away with it, like the Ring of Gyges would allow us to do. John, yes.
Hold on. In a previous lecture, you said that having your soul be in imbalance was unjust. So how is having reason rule over your soul not unjust?
Sorry, I don't follow the argument. What did I say in a previous lecture?
That
How did I say that?
having the soul not be in balance was unjust. That
Yes,
if you have
having the soul not be in its proper balance is unjust. Yes, okay.
yes. So
So
how is having reason rule over all of the parts of your soul not unjust?
Because balance there doesn't mean everything being equal. Balance means that it's in its proper place. For Plato, having the soul being balanced and in harmony means that it's in its proper hierarchical order, and everything is doing its specific role. So balance there doesn't mean that everything, all the parts take turns ruling the soul. No, that's not what it means for Plato. It means that the reason is properly the ruler of the soul. And so balance means the reason ruling, the spirit kind of coming to the aid of reason to help us discipline our appetites. That's proper balance for Plato. So that's what I mean, and what Plato means when he says the soul being in harmony is just, and the soul being not in proper balance and harmony is unjust. So this is essentially the argument that kind of concludes at least the parts of the Republic that we're looking at, and the thread of the argument in the Republic. I didn't ask you to read Book 10 at all. Book 10, in fact, just to clarify, when Glaucon and Adeimantus present their challenge, remember the challenge was to ultimately to prove that justice is good in itself and for its consequences. But they essentially said the consequences are less controversial of justice. But what Plato does in Book 10 is he basically provides a very elaborate argument about the benefits of being just to the gods and kind of in the afterlife. So there's an elaborate argument there about the consequences of justice in the kind of eternal life or the life of the soul or in the afterlife. But that's, I think, a less central part of the thread of the argument. So we're not focusing on that for our purposes. The central challenge, the difficult part of the challenge, was to show that justice is good in itself. That is the real difficult part that is the challenge to Socrates in books 1 and 2. Okay, so here we will leave off our discussion of the Republic and finally move on to our discussion of Aristotle's Politics. I see we're at time for a break. Let me just say just take a moment to notice the segment of this. This is a part of a painting by Raphael called The School of Athens, it places Plato and Aristotle at its center, and the School of Athens is in some way kind of referring to, although a little bit more abstractly, it's kind of talking about Athenian society more generally. But Plato ended up founding a great academy that is often thought of as one of the first examples of an institution of higher learning, and why we sometimes call the university today the academy kind of goes back to Plato's academy. And Plato had his most kind of famous student from the academy was Aristotle. And so Plato and Aristotle are depicted at the center of this painting by Raphael called the School of Athens. And so Aristotle is actually a direct student of Plato. And his great, Aristotle has many great texts, but one of them that we focus on for our purposes is Aristotle's Politics, because it focuses on his political theory as opposed to his moral thought or his other epistemological or other kind of philosophical thought. So we will focus on a few chapters, a few segments of Aristotle's Politics. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that we will kind of bring out a couple of contrasts between Aristotle and Plato, but in fact, Aristotle directly comments on Plato's Republic and offers his critiques and disagreements of Plato's Republic in Book 2 of the Politics. So in Aristotle's Book 2 of the Politics, which I have not assigned you to read, just again, very limited time here, but I encourage you to look at it. And in Book 2 of the Politics, Aristotle actually engages with a number of the arguments that we've been looking at in Plato's Republic, and he disagrees quite staunchly with many parts of his teacher's arguments, of Plato's arguments in the Republic. So I encourage you to look at those parts in Book 2, but we won't have time to go through those arguments ourselves, because we want to bring out just a few other aspects of Aristotle's arguments that will help us to build going forward and help us provide some more vocabulary that's important for us to think through. So before we jump into some of Aristotle's Politics, let's take our break. Let's take 10 minutes here. It is 1:28 now. Let's come back in 10 minutes and talk about Aristotle's Politics. Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Okay, so Aristotle's Politics. We don't have a lot of time with Aristotle, so we just want to pull out some themes that both help us understand what we've read a little better, understand some other aspects of kind of Athenian political thought at this point, and also help us to set some vocabulary and some terminology for some of the things we'll do, and some of the arguments and ideas that we'll be talking about later in the course. So Aristotle is quite a foundational figure, and so we at least want to bring in a little bit of some aspects of his thought and gets a bit familiar with some of them to move forward. So let me first pull out some themes from Book 1, the sections that I've asked you to read from Book 1 of Aristotle's Politics. And the way the text begins and some of the key points here in the beginning for understanding how Aristotle approaches the themes of politics is first to understand something more broadly about his worldview, and that I think is more general to ancient Greek worldview more generally. And that is the idea of everything having a certain kind of nature and a certain kind of purpose, that everything in the world has a purpose, it has a task, it has a nature. And Aristotle, we've seen this already, of course, with Plato. And so Aristotle helps us think and fill in this picture a bit more, because it just kind of is a bit taken for granted in the Republic. But Aristotle helps us in these early pages of the Politics to understand this part. So Aristotle says here that everything in nature is created with a kind of task, with a with some purpose to it, and that that purpose, the nature of something, is best understood by thinking forward to what it is or what it does when it is fully developed, when it is matured, when it is at its kind of endpoint. So he says on 1252, 1252b, and there's a kind of different marginal numbering system here in Aristotle. 1252b, line 30 says, "For we say that each thing's nature, for example, that of a human being, a horse, or a household, is the character it has when it's coming into being, its process of coming into being, its development, has been completed." So we judge the nature of something by what it is when it is fully developed, when it is mature. So in other words, there's an element here of what we call teleology. That is, the nature of something is in its end point. It's telos, what it is internally driven to become. So everything in nature is kind of in a process of development, in a process of coming into being, as Aristotle said there. And when it's coming into being, is fully mature, developed, that is something's end point. And the nature of anything is determined by its end point, what it is kind of destined to become, or what it is if it is able to reach its full potential, that is its nature. So sometimes we think of the nature when we talk about nature in kind of more contemporary usage of that term, we tend to think of something like that it's essential, immutable traits that it has throughout its existence, from the start to the end, the thing that is unchanging and fixed, that is something's essence or its nature. For Aristotle, it's more about the 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 process of what it is coming to be. So the nature of the seed is to become the fully developed plant that it contains the potentiality for. So for Aristotle, everything in nature has a nature, it has a purpose, it has a task, and he lays that out as well, where he says that he says 1252b, line 1, nature produces nothing skimpily, but instead makes a single thing for a single task, because every tool will be made best if it serves to perform one task rather than many. Okay? Here, notice the resonances with Platonic thinking. Aristotle is clearly in line with his teacher, Plato, here, where he says things are made with a singular purpose. Nature doesn't make things willy-nilly. It doesn't make things wastefully or skimpily. It makes things with a particular task to achieve and to perform. And so, again, you have a sense here of Aristotelian kind of cosmology, or his way of looking at the universe, is that everything in the world is infused with a nature, with a purpose and a task and an endpoint to which it is striving. that is developing towards that, and that it if it reaches its full potentiality, it would become. Now, that doesn't mean that everything will inevitably reach its telos, but that is what it is kind of its inner drive is towards. That's what its potentiality is towards. That is what, um, so there's a kind of what we might call a normativity to this, where, and this is again resonant with Plato's thinking that the soul is given three parts and they each have a specific task to play. And so together they can kind of reach, the person can reach its full potentiality by all of the three parts of the soul working together in their proper fashion, in their proper role and task. So this is the first kind of thing to understand about Aristotelian kind of his way of thinking about the world, and that will eventually lead us into how he thinks about politics. Other kind of concept I want to bring out from early on in these chapters is the idea of the composite whole. And what I mean by this, and what Aristotle gets at in these early pages of the Politics, is that if everything in nature is given a task or a role, often these different things in nature need one another. They are not self-sufficient on their own. They exist in kind of systems with other things, where all of these parts are properly working together to achieve a kind of whole. If none of them are self-sufficient, that they need to work with other things that have different natures, that tells you that you've got parts to a whole. And it's only when you have a self-sufficient whole, a whole thing that is made up of different parts that together make that thing self-sufficient, self-functioning, where it doesn't need other things to survive and to reach its endpoint. Only then do you have a kind of relative whole or a unit. Now, this is all very abstract, of course, but it's going to get very much more concrete in a moment when we think about politics. But the composite whole is the idea that they're a self-sufficient unit comprised of many parts that allows each to fulfill its nature. So this is what a composite whole is. Aristotle says on 1252a, line 18, "For as in other cases, a composite has to be analyzed until we reach things that are incomposite, since these are the smallest parts of the whole." So again, there's idea of there are units of analysis that are made up of parts. And you know that you've got parts rather than a whole because the parts fit together to allow the whole to function self-sufficiently. Okay, you can just think about like the system of our bodies and how it all, like all the different systems work together, and that say none of them could, particularly the circulatory system couldn't function without the nervous system. Like these systems function together and our different organs function together, and to create the whole that is our body, and they need each other to create the whole. So this is the kind of idea Aristotle's getting at about all things in the world. Now, what also follows from this for Aristotle is that the whole then is prior to its parts. So the parts are actually, their purpose is to be part of the whole. And so the whole is actually the nature of the thing. That the telos of the thing is to be part of this whole. And so that's the kind of nature of things, and that is it is therefore prior to the parts. The parts are merely a kind of means to an end in that way of being part of this whole. So 1253A. So the key argument where this is being, this broader kind of philosophical way of looking at the universe, where it comes down and becomes much more concrete for Aristotle, and why he's explaining this here in a text on the Politics, is around the human being and his claim, very, very famous claim from early on in this text, that human beings are by nature political animals. So this is what, to understand this phrase is why we have to understand what he means by nature, how he thinks about this, and how things in nature are they are parts to a whole, and the whole is prior to its parts. This hits the ground here when he makes this argument about the nature of human beings. And Aristotle makes this very interesting claim that human beings are by nature political creatures. We are naturally drawn to politics, to living together and working together in political societies. So we have to understand what he means by this, and that's why we're painting this broader picture of the background here. He says, it is evident from 1253a, line 1, it is evident from these considerations then that a city-state is among the things that exist by nature, that a human being is by nature a political animal, and that anyone who is without a city-state, not by luck but by nature, is either a poor specimen or else superhuman. So human beings are by nature part of political societies, polities, we can call them, because he's talking about a city-state. He's thinking about the politics as in that way. But of course, we think about politics in different units than Aristotle may have. But the point nonetheless is that humans are political by nature. And what does he mean by this? Well, it goes back to something Plato talked about when they were founding the ideal city. And remember, Plato said, none of us are self-sufficient. We all have a particular task. We have particular skills. We can't do everything ourselves to live well, live fully on our own. Human beings don't do that. We need other people. And so we talked about how people come together to meet their basic needs, and they come together in even bigger units to meet all of their wants and needs. And that's where the city comes from. Aristotle is getting at something very similar here. What he says is that human beings are not self-sufficient on their own. They need other people. And especially, they need other people. Remember how Aristotle thinks about nature. Your nature is to reach your full development. He's not saying that it's impossible for people to live outside of society, to go off into the forest and live alone. He's not saying that's not possible. What he's saying is for human beings to reach their full and proper development, their natures, their telos, achieve their telos, their full potentiality, they have to live in political societies. So let's go back to the text here, 1252b, line 27. A complete community constituted out of several villages, once it reaches the limit of total self-sufficiency, practically speaking, is a city-state. It comes to be for the sake of living, but it remains in existence for the sake of living well. Very important line. We'll come back to that. This is why every city-state exists by nature, since the first communities do. For the city-state is their end, and nature is an end. For we say each thing's nature, for example, that of a human being, a horse, or a household, this is the passage I read earlier, is the character it has when its coming into being has been completed. That, moreover, that for the sake of which something exists, that is to say, its end, is best, and self-sufficiency is both end and best. So there's a kind of claim here about it's best. It is the ideal for anything to reach its full development, and its full development is when it is self-sufficient. And it's not just self-sufficient in terms of surviving. For human beings, the highest form of living, its full development for human beings, is living well, living a good life. And how do we live a good life? Well, we only live a good life together. The only way to live a good life is with one another in political societies. And we'll see a little bit more as we go about what we mean by why it is that we need other people and what a political society is for in that way. But before we get there, let's first look at the parts to the whole a little bit further, because Aristotle goes on here to describe in these early chapters not just the city-state, but it's some of its constitutive elements. It's the parts that make it up. And the one that he focuses on a great deal is the household. So we get more of a sense here of how Aristotle and the ancient Athenians think about the household, especially with regard to gender and children and as we've talked about before, slavery. So what Aristotle says is that the households make up villages which end up making up city-states. So the unit there, the starting unit, is like individuals which make up households. So what are the households? Again, we have to think about each of these as like the parts that make up together, that come together to make up a whole of self-sufficiency. So we need each other, and so we have certain pairings and roles in the household, which is made for our subsistence. He talks about one hierarchy as the father-child relationship. So that is that kind of age-based hierarchy of the father, who's the kind of head of household here. This is Aristotle's. There's a kind of patriarchal vision here of the father as the head of household and who rules over the child in the household. So that's one natural hierarchy within the household. The child needs the father to guide them to their development. Aristotle also talks about the husband-wife hierarchy, and that again, husbands here are portrayed as kind of superiors to wives. Let me just kind of go to part of the text where he talks about this. This is 1259b. He says, for a man rules, this is starting of chapter 12, for a man rules his wife and children both as free people, but not in the same way. Instead, he rules his wife the way a statesman does, and his children the way a king does. We'll leave that aside for now. For a male, unless he is somehow constituted contrary to nature, is naturally more fitted to lead than a female, and someone older and completely developed is naturally more fitted to lead than someone younger and incompletely developed. So we have this sense here of like there's a kind of natural hierarchy of the father and husband over the women and children in the household. Um, he also says here, and again, why Aristotle's kind of his argument about men and women here plays out further in 1260a, lines 10 to 15. He talks about, again, the parts of the soul and why the man rules over the women and children. He says, and slaves. He says, for free rules slaves, male rules female, and man rules child in different ways, because while the parts of the soul are present in all these people, they are present in different ways. The deliberative part of the soul is entirely missing from a slave. A woman has it, but it lacks authority. A child has it, but it is incompletely developed. So here he's saying the parts of the soul are different in different people. In Aristotle's, his kind of delineation of different human beings. And he argues here, again, there's Athens is a slave-holding society. Slavery is woven into the very fabric of Athenian society, and Aristotle here provides a real argument and justification for slavery. And he talks about, and so let me bring up that third hierarchy, the master-slave. So he talks about here that the head of the household will rule over these different parts because of its soul being different. So for women, he says the deliberative part of the soul, reason, is is there, but it lacks authority in women, he says. This is his basis for the sexism of his doctrine. Reason lacks authority. He doesn't elaborate very well on what he means by this, but he says it lacks authority. In the slave, he says the deliberative part of the soul is missing entirely. And for children, it is incompletely developed. So that's what the justification for why the male head of the household rules over these other parts. And of course, this is all part of why women, children, and slaves are themselves not considered like citizens of Athens. This is why they are not full participants in politics, because they are part of the household. They are there essentially to provide for and be led by the male head of household, and to provide that male head of household with the kind of leisure to be able to himself participate in politics. So again, there's a sense here of like a real division of humanity into different groups and to different hierarchies. And that is, it's Aristotle is quite troubling in these ways. And of course, Aristotelian thought was in fact given new life many centuries later to justify modern forms of slavery. Because what Aristotle also argues in these pages is that slaves, because they can't function, they don't have proper deliberative function, they need the judgment, they need to be led by their masters. And so they are essentially born to be a part of their masters. They are kind of an extension of their masters' bodies. They are like a tool that the master uses for his own purposes. So Aristotle provides a very kind of troubling argument here for not only slavery in his own time, but of argument that ends up providing a justification for slavery many centuries later as well. Nonetheless, we get the picture here of how that Aristotle is painting of like, there's a bunch of these people in the household that are like kind of just there to serve the male head of household. And they are guided by him, and they serve to take care of his needs and free him up for political participation. And so here we come back to the polis, or the political community, and back to Aristotle's claim that humans are by nature political animals. Now that we've traced the background a little bit here, we should be very clear. Aristotle does not really mean all human beings are political by nature. Because many human beings, in fact, the vast majority of human beings who are children, women, slaves, are kind of not actually political. The only indirect way that they're political is by serving their role to help make politics and political participation possible for the head of their household. Nonetheless, they are all parts to the whole. They are parts to the household, which becomes part of which ultimately becomes part of a city. So why is a human being by nature a political animal, as we said earlier? Well, again, we have the picture here of individuals comprise households, which comprise villages, which end up comprising the polis or the city-state. And human beings, he says, are political by nature because they come together for the sake of living, but the city-state remains in existence for the sake of living well. So living well only happens in the polis, or the political community, the political society. Again, what does he mean by this? Your needs are met, so you come together with others for the sake of living, but ultimately the city state allows you not only to just live, but to live well. We come together in households and villages for the sake of basic subsistence, but for the purposes of reaching our full development, our full potentialities, we come together in city states. And to understand what Aristotle is getting at here, we have to follow the argument that he makes just after this, where he talks about about humans and language and the good. Again, the moral characteristics of us and our lives and our natures. So again, he says, nature doesn't make anything skimpily, doesn't make anything wastefully. Everything is made with a purpose. And so Aristotle asks, shortly after he's talking about, he's made the claim that humans are by nature political animals. He says, human beings have speech, and that tells us something. He says, 1253a, line 8 or so, it is also clear why a human being is more of a political animal than a bee or any other gregarious animal. Nature makes nothing pointlessly, as we say, and no animal has speech except a human being. He goes on to say, but speech is for making clear what is beneficial or harmful, and hence also what is just or unjust. For it is peculiar to human beings in comparison to the other animals that they alone have perception of what is good and bad, just or unjust, and the rest. And it is community in these that makes a household and a city-state. Okay, so a lot there, but a very important passage. What Aristotle is telling us here is that humans have speech, and that's for a purpose. What speech allows us to do, more than anything else, what it distinctively allows us to do, is to render judgments, to decipher and determine and judge good and bad, just and unjust. So language gives us our moral qualities, our moral faculties. It's because of language that we are able to evaluate and discuss and analyze what is good and bad, what is higher and what is lower. And that allows us to lead our lives in a different way than other animals. It allows us to lead our lives evaluating. It allows us to lead our lives with a moral sensibility, with a sensibility of like, this is good for me to do, and this is bad for me to do, and to judge and decide for ourselves on that basis. And so because human beings have this moral faculty, this moral ability through the capabilities of speech or language, we alone then have this task of trying to live well. Not just live, but we have the distinctive ability to try to live well. And so this is our nature, to live well. And it is only in political community that we do so, for Aristotle. It is only in political community that we get to use our judgments of good and bad, just and unjust. It's where we exercise these judgments. And we get to hone our judgments and practice our judgments and refine our judgments about good and bad, just and unjust, and hold each other accountable to them. That is how we reach our highest natures, our highest potentialities. Again, he's only really talking about men, freeborn men here, non-slave men. And the others are kind of merely instruments for these men to achieve that good life. But the in his worldview, the idea here is that it's in politics that we have the possibility of living a good life because we participate in judgments and evaluation about good and bad, just and unjust. And it's because our and that allows us to lead, like to seek a happy life, a contented life, rather than just a life of that is lived. And so have this we have this task in front of us, and because we have this particular capability and task, it's because of that that we know that the city state is prior to individuals in nature. Why, in other words, that why we are by nature political, why we are kind of naturally drawn to live in political societies is because our highest nature can only be realized in political society, in the city state. So Aristotle concludes just after the passage I was just reading. He says, the city state is also prior in nature to the household and to each of us individually, since a whole is necessarily prior to its parts. And so the city state is the whole. Now we can think back to Socrates' argument in the Credo, where Socrates offered this kind of argument about the individual being organically tied to the community, to the city state, and that it would be totally wrong to attack the survival and the foundation of the city state because you owed everything to that city state. And you were kind of beholden to it as a result. Put in Aristotelian terms, the whole is prior to its parts. The city state is the whole. That's where human beings are destined to be parts of the whole, because it's only together in the city state that we can achieve our highest our highest nature, our highest happiness, our highest form of living well, the good life. Okay, I am out of time, so I will stop there. There's a little bit more, some more to cover with Aristotle, so we will come back to Aristotle next week for maybe half a class before jumping into our discussion of Machiavelli for the remainder of next week. So we'll leave it there for today, and I hope folks have a good weekend. And again, I will get the full assignment guidelines posted so that you have those. I'll get those posted right now. Either I'll post a document along with the portal to submit the assignment. I'll post the full guideline document because I can't seem to post it in the assignment itself. Okay, so we'll leave it there for today and see you folks next week. I'll just stop the recording at this point and and I can answer a couple questions.